Now, who remembers the anthrax attacks in 2001? It kind of got overshadowed by the disaster that we saw at the Twin Towers. And of course, Building 7 came down later. And we've been focused on that so much over the past over 20 years that we forget that there was another wave of attacks that came in. The letters making it seem like this is radical Islamic extremists that are sending this anthrax through the mail. And then some years later, we were told that it was all wrapped up. It was blamed on a scientist that had committed suicide, and there was nothing else to see here. But of course, many people do not trust that story. And our next guest is somebody that knew Bruce Ivins, the person who ultimately was blamed for the attacks, and says that he did not do this. And there's more that the public doesn't know. So let me go ahead and introduce her. This is Dr. Meryl Nass. She's an internal medicine physician and activist with expertise in anthrax and bioterrorism. Her interest is in prevention, investigation, amelioration, and safe and effective medical response. And her expertise and experience includes treating patients with Gulf War syndrome and adverse effects from the anthrax vaccine. So let's go ahead and bring her in. Doctor, welcome to the 24th hour.
Hi. Glad to be here.
Well, yeah, it's to meet you, and I've heard about your work. And I will admit that, we've investigated a little bit on the show into the anthrax attacks, but as I said in the intro, it sort of gets overshadowed by our work here at AE, looking into the destruction of the 3 towers in New York. But there is a lot here, and I'm always suspicious when something gets wrapped up and the person that they say is behind it supposedly committed suicide. Before we get into all of that, please, for our audience, elaborate on your experience and professional background.
Okay, so I was asked to investigate a professor's work at UMass when I was an instructor at UMass in the medical school. And this professor, Curtis Thorne, had previously worked at Fort Detrick and was an anthrax expert. And he was doing research, and the students and some of the faculty were complaining that this was germ warfare research. And I was asked way back around 1988 to look into it. And I did, and I found his contract with the Defense Department was titled Studies for a Better Anthrax Vaccine. But in fact, the nature of the research was moving plasmids around in different bacillus bacteria. That's the family that anthrax is part of. And so he was doing a sort of primitive form of genetic engineering of anthrax. And I learned that this was way outside the Army's mission statement. We had signed the Biological Weapons Convention, went into force in 1975, and so this was 13 years later. We were not supposed to be doing this kind of work. I worked with a Quaker group in Northampton, Massachusetts at that time, and so they and I sent a lot of FOIAs, got a lot of information, and then I wrote several papers about this. And I also studied all the recent anthrax outbreaks of the last 15 years to see whether anthrax was really something to worry about. Could it be used as a biological weapon? Had it been? And I discovered that the world's largest outbreak of anthrax, which had occurred in Rhodesia during its civil war, which is now Zimbabwe, was in fact due to biological warfare. And it took me 3 years, but I was able to publish a paper proving it. And so I'm the only person in the world. Then later, when anthrax vaccine became, in the process of all that, I basically read everything there was on anthrax, published papers, became a speaker about anthrax and bioterrorism during the Gulf War and the lead up to it. And then when the anthrax vaccine program started in 1998, I was, of course, again, asked to get involved, and I wrote the world's first review article on anthrax vaccines, and then testified before Congress and was able to show that the vaccine was neither safe nor had it ever been shown to be effective against inhalation anthrax, which was the purpose for which it was being used. So subsequent to that, I have consulted for the Cuban Ministry of Health and the U.S. Director of National Intelligence and the Latin American branch of the World Bank, the Inter-American Development Bank, on issues of anthrax and biological warfare. And I'm well known for my work on COVID, and I actually had my medical license suspended by the medical board for treating people with hydroxychloroquine, ivermectin, and warning about the dangers of the COVID vaccines. So that's my story.
Well, there's a lot to unpackage there, and we're going to probably maybe get you back onto our regular podcast, 9/11 Freefall, to talk about that at some point. So the anthrax attacks back in 2001, for those of us who lived through it, this was sort of the epilogue to the 9/11 attacks, even though in the end, the official stories came out that it was blamed on not on radical extremists that hate our freedom, but on a disgruntled scientist, they claimed. But people were very scared. These letters were getting mailed out to news agencies, networks, members of Congress, coincidentally ones who maybe were asking some questions before we rolled out the Patriot Act. And it created the effect that was very beneficial for the federal government in getting the Patriot Act rolled out. For our audience, please reiterate how you got involved in the topic. Obviously, you've got a background in anthrax, so that would explain it. But how did you get so involved in Bruce Ivins and looking into whether or not he actually did the things that the news and the government claimed he did?
Well, I knew Bruce a little bit. Since 1991, when I think it was 91, maybe 92, when I'd first attended a conference in Baltimore, at the University of Maryland, that was partially held by the scientists at Fort Detrick, who were trying to explain to the world that they were doing ethical research and were, appropriately following the U.S. mission statement of doing work for biological defense and not offense. And it turned out that I sat next to Bruce in the front row at that conference. And we got to know each other, and then I was actually handing out a paper that had just been published about the whether the U.S. military, which Fort Detrick is part of the Army, had in fact been going beyond what it was allowed to do. And so I was a controversial figure there, but he didn't mind. I probably was a bit challenging to some of the other people at the conference. But anyway, Bruce and I then, shared information on and off for the next 10 years. And I attended, a couple of the international anthrax conferences because I am an anthrax expert. When you sort out the biggest anthrax outbreak in the world and wrote the first review article, you are an expert. So we would often hang out together at these conferences. He was a juggler. I brought my son to one of my kids to one of the conferences to juggle, and Bruce was a juggler. My son was a juggler. Anyway, so we knew each other. And in terms of Bruce being designated as the person who sent the anthrax letters, he was around number 5 or 6 on a long list of people that the FBI or the deep state had tried to pin that crime on. So we can all remember that there was Steve Hatfill, and a trail of breadcrumbs had been laid to try to blame it on Steve Hatfill. There was another fellow who used to work at Fort Detrick who wound up drinking himself to death. There were a couple of doctors from Pakistan that lived outside of Philadelphia that also they were trying to pin it on. There was an ER doctor on the New Jersey shore There was an attempt to pin it on him, and then there was a fellow who used to work at Fort Detrick as a virologist. What was his name? Anyway, an Egyptian guy, and they tried to pin it on him. And then eventually, then they were getting desperate because the anthrax letters had been sent in 2001. And by now we're, in 2008, and a presidential election is coming. And the deep state isn't sure at that point who's going to be elected and whether there's going to be a real investigation. So there was an enormous push, in my opinion. This is all my conclusion. I don't have written evidence to prove that they were in a big hurry in 2008. But at the very end of July 2008, they said Bruce Ivins says July. I think they said he had killed himself on July 28th, and they made the announcement on August 1st, something like that. And I had been following the whole case very closely because I obviously had the ability to understand the evidence, and I'd been writing about it on and off for many years. I had studied the National Academy of Sciences report, and then later there was also a report from the General Accounting Office on the case and on the FBI's. I'd attended 2 congressional hearings where the only witness was FBI Director Mueller talking about the anthrax letters. So anyway, I knew for a number of reasons that there was no evidence whatsoever implicating Bruce. So the thing was, there were 2 sets of anthrax. There were 2 sets of letters, and the anthrax in each set had been prepared differently. Anthrax forms a spore that can be dried and can live, for 100 years once it's dried, and then you give it the right conditions. You put it in someone's lungs, it can come out of the spore form and germinate, grow, and cause disease in a human or an animal or a bird. Anyway, these 2, there was something special. There were several special things about each of these preparations. And the first one was not a very clean, purified preparation, and it contained a contaminant, a bacillus, a different bacillus species that was a contaminant in that first set of letters. The FBI looked all over Fort Detrick and never was able to come up with that contaminant. So, and because anthrax spores are invisible, you can never really clean up a facility that has manufactured a spore-forming organism. And in fact, FDA doesn't allow those facilities to be used to make other forms of vaccine. If you're making an anthrax vaccine, you can't take that building and now turn it into a tetanus, vaccine facility, because you're always going to have spores of the anthrax lying around that you cannot identify and remove. So they were never able to identify that contaminant. In the second set of letters, they were highly, highly purified. There were no contaminants, but the method by which they had been purified did not exist. That could not be done with the equipment that was available at Fort Detrick. And so, I don't believe either of those was made at Fort Detrick. There was a lot of talk about how the anthrax came out of Ivins' flask. He had a flask or several flasks containing anthrax spores in a small amount of liquid. But in fact, it was never proven that the anthrax in the letters, and there were a lot of reasons to think the anthrax in the letters did not come from those flasks. So you'd have to get into the nitty-gritty, which only the scientists do. But that's the story. So what I was told by some of Bruce's colleagues at the time who knew that I had been a friend of his was that actually the FBI was desperately seeking finally to be able to pin this crime on someone. They'd already told him they were going to charge him with the crime, but they were also looking at several other anthrax scientists at Fort Detrick, and they were putting a lot of pressure on all of them and waiting for the weakest link to sort of collapse. And so the colleagues He had about 3 or 4 colleagues who supported him. Were very concerned about that, and they knew he was, emotionally fragile, and he did collapse. He had started drinking heavily, and then he apparently committed suicide. And of course, desperate to close the case and not have anyone else investigate where the anthrax really may have come from, the FBI made sure there was no autopsy. They didn't tell the doctors in the hospital what he had taken as an overdose, which was basically too much Tylenol, because there is an antidote. If you get the antidote within about 24 hours, your life will usually be saved. A Tylenol metabolite kills liver cells, and that's how you die. Anyway, he was not treated for that at the hospital. And he died in the hospital shortly thereafter. So that's my story.
What was the basis of the government's case against them? Like, I understand that, and it's sounding like there wasn't really much there, and they were just sort of reaching around in the dark,
right.
trying
So
to
they
pin it
never
on this
found
guy
a
or that
spore.
guy.
Yeah, they didn't find a spore to match these letters in his car or in his house. The case turned out to be an expensive smoke and mirrors case. So the FBI continued to allege for years, from 2001 to 2008, that they were, doing, very precision, very new science. They were breaking barriers. It was marvelous work they were doing, and it turned out to be nothing at all. None of it was um, uh, definitive by any means. And that is what the National Academy of Sciences report said, and the General Accounting Office, which is the investigative arm of Congress. Their reports both said there was no proof that Ivins was the person. And so the case has really never been solved. And the thing to realize about anthrax is the FBI tried to make it seem that the anthrax was produced during a small window of time, starting at, on 9/11 and ending for the first set of letters, by the 18th when they were mailed, or so when they were mailed, and that the second set of letters was made, or, around that period, and they were mailed, around October 1st. But in fact, as I said, anthrax can live forever once it's dried. There was no reason to think. In fact, this was part of the FBI trying to confuse people. There's no reason whatsoever to think it was made during that period. Could have been made 100 years ago. Could have been made at any time. Could have been made in any country. Could have been made in any laboratory. And a vial of a few grams just handed over to somebody to put in the letters. There was no reason to think that it had to be made in a U.S. anthrax facility, immediately before the letters were sent.
Well, the thing is, everybody in the country thought that this was just a continuation of the 9/11 attacks, because the letters, when they're showing them on television, have this crazy writing on it. It's saying things like "Death to America," 9/11/01, these kinds of things. So you think, okay, this is just the same group, whoever it was that pulled off 9/11 is sending these out to create more hysteria. In the end, of course, again, it's blamed on Bruce Ivins. What does the government say about his motive behind this, to not only, because usually if somebody's got an axe to grind with the government or society or whatever, they tend to take credit for it and go out in a blaze of glory on their own. For instance, the Unabomber wanted the newspapers to publish his manifesto and whatnot. But in this particular case, they're claiming Bruce Ivins not only did this, assuming he, that because he was disgruntled, but also that he was trying to pin it on Muslims. So he's not even taking credit. So what does the government say about his motives for going through all of these steps to make it look like it's a continuation of September 11th? And then what is your reaction to what they say about his motives?
Andrew, if you were a Muslim terrorist, would you tell people what is in the envelopes and tell them to take penicillin and protect themselves? Or would you try to kill as many people as possible?
Well, that's a very good question. Again, I mean, if somebody is actually trying to cause maximum damage and terror, you would tell them that it was something benign on the outside of the envelope and let them be surprised after they open it.
Exactly. So, so the anthrax letters were sent for publicity, for effect, and they were not intended to kill anybody. And in fact, if they hadn't gone through these postal machines that use high pressure equipment that apparently the person who sent them didn't know about, everyone who got the letter and read the warning inside and started taking antibiotics was fine. It was only the postal workers and a few others who didn't know they were exposed, who didn't get the message. You know, Allah is great, take penicillin. It was only those people who died. So this was clearly, the letters were sent to create fear.
That's right. Why do they claim Bruce Ivins would do this? Like stepping into their
Okay,
shoes
so
and
in
they have
terms
to
of
make a
motive,
case.
I mean, yeah, they had to make up a motive. There was no motive. I mean, the guy had been a anthrax researcher at Fort Detrick for about 30 years. There was no reason why he would try to do something crazy. They said that he was afraid that the anthrax research was sort of slowing down and that he might lose his job. But if he, made a big deal about anthrax, then there would continue to be research on anthrax. They said a lot of things that were not true, because I was mentioned in the FBI report. And what they wrote about me wasn't true either. So they just made up a lot of stories to attempt to piece together a story that would work well enough, that the FBI themselves wouldn't be the object of inquiry.
Yeah, I mean, they can claim anything they want. Oh, Bruce Ivins did this so they can have more funding for anthrax if he creates this scare. They could try to pin something on me and say, oh, Andy wanted them to bring back 8-track tapes. Just make up anything, throw it out there. But what evidence do they actually have
They had no
to point
evidence.
to?
I mean, he was helping them do the research to figure out, what was in the envelopes, what kind of anthrax it was, etc. He was working hand in glove with the FBI. That's where they were bringing their samples to. But anyway, like I said, they'd gone through about 6 people before him. They were desperate to close the case, and he was it. They put a lot of pressure on him.
Right. Now, something that was noted in an article that our own Craig McKee wrote for AE 911 Truth a couple of years ago, where they cite you, is that you explained that Ivins did work exclusively with liquid anthrax, not the powdered variety used in the attacks. Now, I mean, on the surface, we can see why that is so significant. It's a different chemical composition, a different type of field. Now, theoretically, I mean, does that exclude him from being able to use the powdered anthrax? How significant is that point?
So it's a very significant point, because if you start with liquid anthrax and you just dry it, then you have to sort of pound it. You have to put it through a process to break it up, if you're starting with the kind of anthrax that he had in his flasks, and you don't get this very fine powder, fluffy stuff that you got in the second set of letters. You can get the junk that you had in the first set of letters. So the first set could potentially have been made at Fort Detrick, except they never found the contaminant that was in it. So it probably wasn't. The second set, nobody knew how to make it. In fact, Sandia Lab National Laboratory claimed that they tried over 40 times to reverse engineer the anthrax and figure out how it was made, the fluffy anthrax in the second set of letters, and that they never could. There were unusual elements in this spore, in the outside of the spore. It's sort of in the external portion of the spore coat. And so nobody knew how to do that at Fort Detrick. We don't know where that, I mean, no one's admitted that they know how to make that kind of anthrax. I'm sure
Now,
people do.
What gets me, and again, some of
But
the
it would be a
science and stuff.
bioweapon. So let me be more explicit. You're not allowed to make bioweapons. You're allowed to do research on anthrax for defensive purposes. If you're making a form of anthrax that you've put additives in to make it float through the air and cause inhalation anthrax in the most efficient manner, that's not allowed in the Biological Weapons Convention, which is why nobody's going to admit that they made it.
Well, no, and that's why it has to be blamed on some party that does not come from from any official legal research that the U.S. government is doing. Now, I don't believe that everything that our government or other governments around the world are doing is out in the open, and there's probably a lot of secret stuff going on that they don't want us to know about, this included. This would be basic. What gets me here, then there's so many scientific arguments that can be made for why this doesn't add up, but it is the nature of just how this entire investigation was done that, okay, the effect that we wanted, but now we got to pin this on someone. We can't just have this, sitting out there without a conclusion. For instance, in the case of the Twin Towers in Building 7 back in 2011, they said, hey, a bunch of Navy SEALs killed bin Laden, and then they tossed his body in the ocean for some reason before there was any kind of independent verification. Even the news person I watched that night didn't buy it, but she wasn't going to say it. She just made a comment. So they have to wrap this up as well. But if you really look into it, though, they kind of luck out, the federal government. To say this in a cynical way, because now Bruce Ivins, quote, commits suicide, and suddenly their suspect, the person they're pinning this on, can't even defend himself. So what that means is that this doesn't go to trial. There's no lawyer that's going to stick up for him and make the case that you're talking about now. You could have probably been brought in as a witness, I assume, to make this case to a jury. So he doesn't defend himself, and they can just kind of slide this down America's throats and wrap up the entire story. I think that's a key thing, is that their case has never really been put to the test through a jury trial or any kind of real debate other than what we're doing here.
They have never provided the evidence. The FBI had a meeting in mid-September, after it had, or maybe before. Both of them happened in September. As I said, there were the two congressional hearings, the House and the Senate, querying Mueller. And then they had a meeting with scientists, and they said, we're going to give you the evidence. And then they also provided a whole bunch of stuff to the committee, the National Academy of Sciences Committee. And nowhere in any of all that, was there real evidence that would convict anyone of having made the anthrax or delivered it, right? Because you've got the person who made it may have nothing to do with the person who delivered it. And the person who put it in the envelopes may have only put it in the envelopes. They may not have known where those envelopes were going. The person who wrote the addresses on the envelopes and the messages, they may not have known. I mean, we don't know how many people there were. Though, and in addition to the letters that did have anthrax, there were a lot of hoax letters sent around the same time, some of which had powder in them, and they were sent from a multitude of addresses. So one was supposedly sent from either Malaysia or Philippines. One was from Florida. One was from England. And so the question is, who's sending those false, who knows at the same time that they're, to send fake anthrax letters, and who is in those locations at that time? Bruce Ivins was not, none of the scientists from Fort Detrick were in all those locations. There were so many problems to the story. I mean, they had him delivering the letters in a mailbox in Princeton, New Jersey, and then getting back to Fort Detrick the same, leaving from his home in Frederick, Maryland, driving all the way to Princeton, driving back, and managing to do all this in a very, very tight time period where there was no evidence he'd stopped anywhere for gas. It's, I guess, about a 3-hour trip each way. There was never any evidence that Bruce could be pinned at any part of this crime. On no one part of this crime could be pinned on Bruce.
Other than you, is there anybody out there speaking up for him? You know, he's passed away, and so again, the thinking would be that
his colleagues. So when he died, the church, the funeral the church could not fit all the people who attended his funeral. So the town of Frederick had hundreds and hundreds of people there, all of whom thought he was innocent.
Wow. Wow. This is a story that needs to be unpacked even more. And I'm sure some people have tried. I know you were on the anthrax committee for the lawyers committee for 9/11 inquiry. They've tried to do some work there, but this needs to continue being investigated and dug up because not just for Bruce Ivins, because he's passed away and everything. He does deserve to have his name cleared, and people should know what the government did to try to pin this on him, but also because we need to know who actually did this evil work right after September 11th and terrorized the country. And the answer might surprise you where that source actually was. But how?
Well, I would say that, look, the FBI covered up whatever evidence they had of who may have been involved with the letters and worked very hard to pin it on a bunch of people, having to pay, Steve Hatfill $5.8 million for what they did. The FBI offered some very large amount of money to one of Ivan's children if the child would turn his father in. So I would say that where you're going to find the evidence is in the FBI's files.
That's disgusting. Wow. Offering him money to turn their father in? That doesn't even sound like a real investigation. That sounds like a bribe. There's a lot that needs to be dug into here. How do people research your work on this matter and keep track of your efforts on this and other issues?
A lot of my work, but not all of it, is on a blog called anthraxvaccine.blogspot.com. It is a Google blog. I started it in 2006 or 2007. So my work on the case, starting at that point, is there. I had an earlier website with a lot of work on the case, and that was, disappeared by Bluehost, the company that hosted it, and so that material is lost. I also have if you want my more recent work on COVID and other things, and the use of bioterrorism, and vaccines to bring about the current global biosecurity agenda, and which is part of the New World Order or the Great Reset. You can find that at merylnass.substack.com. And I formed an organization last year to fight the WHO, which was trying to take over the management of public health globally. And that organization is called Dore to Freedom. You can find a lot of information there. And we are hosting with Children's Health Defense a 2-day symposium in September 6 and 7 called the Attack on Food and Farming and How to Fight Back.
All right. Well, that'll be the same night that this airs, but I encourage everybody to check out the archives, go to those websites, and we're definitely going to have you back on 9/11 Freefall to dive into this deeper, because the anthrax attacks should not be forgotten in the big picture of 9/11. But thank you for coming on to our event tonight and talking about this.
Thank you, Andrew.